Good morning, everyone. Welcome back, for many of you, to part 2 of our What's New in Global Mapper version 24. This is one of our GeoTalks Express series. Those of you who were with us on Tuesday had an opportunity to learn about what's new in the standard version of Global Mapper, and today, as we promised at the time, we're going to be covering the new functionality in Global Mapper Pro. I say we. I'm joined once again by my colleague, Jeff Hatzel. Good morning, Jeff. How are you?
Good morning, David. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
I'm delighted to have you back. Jeff, just so you know, is our product manager in charge of kind of steering the continued development of Global Mapper. So delighted to have Jeff. Delighted you could take some time away from your busy schedule to share your expertise, Jeff. We're going to go through this introductory section relatively quickly. Again, I'm assuming most of you have either been through a previous webinar or attended on Tuesday. So a little bit of recap, with apologies, maybe a little bit of a kind of recap and overlap from last session. But just so you know, you are in a webinar. The communication is one way. You are listening to myself, listening to Jeff. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. That said, we encourage you to participate. The questions panel, if you haven't already found it, is over there on the right side of your screen. You can use that as a way to ask questions of myself or Jeff. We do usually like to request that the questions are relevant to the topic, but use that for comments as well. I mean, whatever you want to share with us, whatever maybe suggestions you want to put in as far as functionality is concerned, use that opportunity. We grab the report of those questions after the presentation, and we'll certainly pay attention to what has been placed in there, either questions or again, comments. If you have a question that you asked during the presentation, we will try to address that in real time. We will also follow up with you directly and to answer your questions through email. So the session is being recorded, so as was Tuesdays, those who weren't in our session on Tuesday will have an opportunity to look at the recording of that. This one is being recorded as well, so you'll get a notification hopefully within the next few days about the availability of the recording. Again, quickly recapping our upcoming sessions. We've got 2 more left this calendar year. We're going to shift our focus in November to talk about Geographic Calculator. We've got a pending release of that application. If you haven't looked at that before as a Global Mapper user, might be an opportunity to learn a little bit about what that tool does and how it works in conjunction with Global Mapper. December session, as we wrap up the year, is going to be more of an interactive session. We're going to answer a lot of your questions. Now, those questions will be pulled from questions that we have received in our tech support inbox, and also we're going to give you an opportunity maybe to submit some additional questions. This is going to be driven by you folks, in other words, our December session. More information you note here. You can go to bluemarblegeo.com, and ultimately you can navigate into our GeoTalks Express section. Training classes, again, quick recap. We have training coming up next month, just about a month from now, just over a month from now. We're doing our Global Mapper class. We divide our class into kind of a Global Mapper, the core functionality of the application. The following week, we'll focus specifically on LiDAR. This is a very popular class. We're finding a lot of folks like to take the LiDAR class. It obviously introduces a lot of the tools we're going to be talking about today, a lot of the LiDAR processing tools that are in Global Mapper Pro. We also offer custom training, and this is something we want to make sure you're aware of. If your company maybe needs more specialized training, that's definitely something that we can set up for you, adapting it to your needs, maybe even incorporating your workflows and your data into that training class. Let us know if that's something you're interested in. I put some contact information at the bottom, the website, and included an email address as well. So if you need more information, don't hesitate to get in touch, training@bluemarblegeo.com. Now, I want to pause here briefly while we're on this subject of training. As you will know, those of you who've been in our webinars before will know we like to get a little bit of interaction going. And we're going to ask you another question here. In our session on Tuesday, we asked you which version of Global Mapper we're using. We're going to ask you specifically about training in this session. I'm going to launch a poll from off screen. Hopefully this will appear on your screen in just a second. I'm going to ask you if you, or perhaps even some of your colleagues, are interested in training, and if so, what format would that training be in? Again, speak on. You can answer this on your own behalf, or perhaps on behalf of maybe your colleagues or folks that you would anticipate working with in your company. We are looking at our schedule for the coming calendar year for 2023, and we had a meeting recently. We were discussing what our best approach would be. Are we ready to go back into the classroom again? I know a lot of people are cautious about those in-person classes, so we want your input. Is this going to be something that's valuable to you? And again, I'll bring back the previous screen in just a second, where you can contact us directly if you want to provide more information about what you feel would be the best way that you would receive training. So I'll just leave this open for a few more seconds. Again, appreciate your input. This is really helping us in terms of our planning for our training schedule for next year. I wasn't going to share the results with this. This is kind of our own information, but I think I will. I'll go ahead and give you the results of what was noted here. It's a little small on my screen, but I find it interesting that not very many of you answered the final one, which is I don't need training. So obviously you're acknowledging to some level that you need some training. That's good to know, because we will, as I said, be looking at our schedule, as I said, for the coming year. So interesting, a reduced number in-person class training. Had we asked this question a few years ago, I think that might have been a little different. So appreciate your input again. Let me hide that poll question, and hopefully you're seeing the original screen. If you want to follow up on that, now that I've kind of whetted your appetite a little bit, note at the bottom of the screen the email address. Please get in touch and let us know what type of training you specifically might be interested in. Again, custom training is definitely an option. Thank you for your participation in that poll. Really appreciate your input. Okay, let's get back on our agenda here. Let's back on the schedule. Scholarship, again, quickly recapping something we brought up on Tuesday. We're going to be offering a $1,000 scholarship to any student, basically an undergraduate or graduate student. We did have a question as to whether there's a geographic limit. Do we just restrict this to folks here in the US? Absolutely not. Wherever you are in the world, if you're a student, you can submit a thesis, written project, report, poster, whatever, some project that involves in some way Blue Marble applications, and I think specifically Global Mapper. We will select a winner from those who submit, and some of the winners over past years have been really interesting use cases, teaching us a lot about how our software is being used. We will announce that winner during our user conference in January. And deadline for submission, as you can see, is the end of the calendar year. So if you're a teacher, let your students know. If you're a student, look at what projects are pending on in your curriculum, and you can submit whatever you do. Again, the only requirement here is that it does involve Blue Marble's application. So more information again about this and our other academic programs at the website you see at the bottom of the screen. Let's get on to today. What are we going to be covering today? Well, in our Tuesday session, we focus specifically on the components of Global Mapper that are within this, what we call the standard edition. That is the base level version of Global Mapper. Today, our focus is going to shift to Global Mapper Pro. And I think maybe, Jeff, I'm going to maybe defer to you on this one. Well, before we actually begin, a quick reminder as to what exactly Global Mapper Pro is and how did that come about. So when we get into the actual workflows themselves, we're going to begin by looking at a couple of new tools that were introduced to streamline the process of developing Global Mapper scripts. I'm going to take a look at a couple of examples of these new workflows that really streamline and simplify the idea of running the procedures in Global Mapper using a script. Jeff is going to jump in afterwards and introduce what is arguably the most complex component that Global Mapper has ever introduced, and that brings in this idea of geostatistical analysis, specifically kriging. We're going to spend a little bit of time before we look at the application itself explaining what that is, so you know what you're getting into. And then again, Jeff will show us a specific example of how that works. We've introduced a tool that's actually displayed in the screenshot over on the right side of my screen here for detecting and visualizing the overlap between flight lines within a point cloud. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing an overlap representation. So very simple tool, but I'll show you that. It's a new button you may have noticed in the toolbar, those of you who are using Global Mapper 24 already, and we'll demonstrate how that works. We've been working on Global Mapper Mobile, a parallel kind of project, if you like, as we develop the desktop application. That mobile version is also being developed, and tying them together has always been something that we want to focus on as far as kind of continued development is concerned. And that is coming out here with version 24, where we now have a really efficient tool for merging data from maybe multiple folks in the field back into the desktop application. And Jeff's going to take a look at the dialog box that allows you to do that, address those changes that would have occurred for your deployed data. Final bullet here, and this will hopefully bring us up towards the end of our session. We're going to take a look at pixels to points. It is a major part of the Global Mapper Pro setup. We're not going to demonstrate the tool itself. We've done that in the past, but I want to show you one specific addition that's been applied with version 24, and that is the identification of overlap for images. And we'll explain a little more detail when we get to that point, the importance of overlap, and show you a new reporting system that tells you how much overlap there is within your data. So, Jeff, before we get into the application, again, maybe a brief overview of how Global Mapper Pro came about and where that stands in our product offering.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who have been with Blue Marble and Global Mapper for a while, I'm sure you remember the LiDAR module. And over the past couple of years, we really started working on some more advanced tools that were, getting put into the LiDAR module, but were not necessarily LiDAR specific tools. I mean, specifically the first, three bullets on the page today. And we started to think about how we could better represent the advanced functionality in the application without pigeonholing everything into just LiDAR. And so that's how we came up with the Pro edition of Global Mapper. So still all of your LiDAR analysis tools are in there, as well as more advanced functionality as well, some of which you can use with your LiDAR workflows and other of which may be completely independent, depending on how you implement your work in the application.
Okay, so I mean, originally intended as a kind of a mechanism for, from a development point of view for incorporating LiDAR functionality, it is kind of taking on a life of its own. I'm going to take a look at an example of that to start this. I'm going to fire up a brand new instance of Global Mapper here. Let's go ahead and bring it up. We didn't mention this in the session on Tuesday, but you can see very clearly in the middle of my screen here that I'm using Global Mapper Pro. This is obviously a visual indication of, the addition of Global Mapper that I was using. Had I not added a license for Global Mapper Pro, the icon in the middle or the graphic in the middle would simply say Global Mapper. So obviously I've got the Pro version, and with that comes the additional tools. Now, the first tool that we're going to demonstrate here is an improvement to the process of developing Global Mapper scripts. Global Mapper scripts are not new in of themselves. Scripting has been around for as long as Global Mapper has been around, and I know many of you are using Global Mapper scripts to essentially automate or streamline recurring workflows. You do the same thing again and again. The easiest way to do that is using a script rather than having to manually interact with the interface. Now, creating scripts traditionally required you to do some manual text entry, or whether that be within Notepad or whatever external text editor you're using, or more recently we introduced an embedded editor. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. That was introduced in the previous release of Global Mapper. But what we've introduced with version 24 is a script recording function. This has been asked about for many years. When we conduct training classes and introduce scripting, that is a question that very often will come up. Can I interact with the interface and capture what I do and use that as a script? Well, the answer to that was always, we're thinking about it, we're looking at it, and we're planning it. Well, now we can say, yes, you can do that. And I'm going to demonstrate how that process works. So in order to do that, I'm just going to go through a very common workflow in Global Mapper. I'm going to bring in some data. I'm going to generate some contours. I'm going to export those contours to a shapefile. Just a very simple workflow. But in doing that, I'm also going to record the process that will then be a pre-formatted script. So to begin this process, I'm going to go to the File menu and introduce the new component here. It's about halfway down, Open Script Builder. This is the new tool. It pops up a little dialog box. Looks like I've got a few things in here already. Let me remove what I'd done previously. See if I can multi-select here.
David, while you're doing that, I'll address a question that came in. Somebody asked if Pro features come standard or if they're a separate license. And the Pro edition of Global Mapper is a separate license in addition to the Global Mapper standard version. So if you were in the webinar on Tuesday, everything we talked about on Tuesday is the standard version. Visually, right, the application today looks very much the same, but you now have access to some of the tools we're looking at today, and then some that have already been included in the application for a while, but that is a separate license.
Yeah, and from a technical point of view, when you download Global Mapper, you download a single application, but it's the level of license that you apply that will unlock the necessary function. I see a lot of questions coming in now just while I'm looking at the panel, just to answer another one that just came in. Can you build Python scripts? Yes, you can. Global Mapper with version 23 supports Python. Now, what we're going to be looking at today specifically.
Just to clarify on that, David, the script builder does not record Python yet. It just records Global Mapper.
Right, I guess I'm interpreting build as being create. You can create Python scripts, I'll show you in a second, in the scripting editor, or you can use existing Python scripts as another tool. But yes, within this specific tool that I'm looking at right now, this will only create the Global Mapper script. We're going to see that a little bit later. Thanks for the clarification, Jeff. Okay, So you'll notice having loaded this, and if you had not done what I had previously done, it would be empty. This is the way it will look by default. Very simple little interface here. We've got a record button, which is going to be enabled by default. You can stop recording at any time if you want to explore other functions within Global Mapper that you do not necessarily need to incorporate into your script. You can stop. And then most importantly, when you're done, you can export the results of this, and you'll see we'll actually load what we export into the script editor so we can actually see the results, see what has been generated automatically. So this floating window can sit here, it can be docked, as you can see. Sometimes I like to dock these smaller windows right below my control center here, and maybe move it around wherever you want. It can be a floating window as well. So in order to initiate this process, I'm kind of backward here. Let me bring my control center back over to the right side again. In order to demonstrate this, I'm simply going to go through that very simple workflow that I described previously. I'm going to generate some contours. I have nothing loaded on my screen, so the first action that I'm going to take is to load some data. And this will be, as you'll see, recorded as the first command in my script. So I'm not going to open a file. Typically, you'll initiate the process, or most processes, by loading some data. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to load all of the files in a directory. It's a slight variation on the process of loading data. Now, the reason I'm taking this approach, hopefully, will become clear in just a few minutes. It's remembered my directory location. This, again, navigating to a folder, not navigating to a specific file. There is a grid file in here, Global Mapper grid file in my input folder. So I'm just simply going to click OK, and it's going to ask me to apply a mask if necessary. I don't have to do this, but if I want to limit the types of data, or indeed provide some sort of wildcard in here just to target specific files, I can do that. I have to tell you, there's only one file in here, so this approach is probably not practical in a real world situation, but again, the reason I'm taking this approach hopefully will become clear just a little bit. So again, it's just going to be looking for the GMG files, of which I hope there's one, and there is. It's somewhere in the vicinity of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and you can see I've got a section of terrain here. You will notice in the script builder that action has been recorded, and there's command, the parameters. We're not seeing very many, but we can expand this as necessary. We'll see this in the script itself a little bit later. So I'm initiating this process of recording my actions now. Now, phase 2 of this, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the process of generating contours. I'm going to generate some very low resolution contours. In fact, I'm going to really dumb down the resolution just in the interests of speed here. Now, the important thing here is whatever I apply here in terms of settings is going to be incorporated into my script. So if I change any of these parameters, if I change my contour interval multiplier, my index contours, or if I decide to make peaks and depressions, all of these settings that I'm applying manually within the interface are going to be incorporated into the corresponding command when I look at my final script. So again, we'll just leave this as is. We'll click OK. Shouldn't take too long, and we'll see some contours on our screen. Very standard workflow in Global Mapper. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And again, you can see that now in the script builder as step number 2, my second command. Final workflow, we're going to export what we just did. And specifically, we're going to export a vector file containing the line features to a shapefile. Shapefile is already selected. Again, I have to avoid the temptation to go through my training spiel here. We're going to do this as quickly and smoothly as possible. I'm defining an output path here, and I'm going to write these into a folder that I've created already called output. And we'll give them a name. We'll call it contours. That will be the name of my shapefile. It is a series of lines. Obviously, that's the only option when I export my shapefile. There are no areas or points on the map, so those are not available. And again, I'll generate a PRJ file. Whatever other options I would apply here, parameters or settings I apply for my exported file, will also be recorded as parameters in this final command. So we'll click OK to initiate this export process. Should not take long. Again, noted here in the script builder, we have step number 3 recorded. Now from off screen, I'm going to drag into view what I just did. Here we go. This is what I did, and this is what you would expect. Interacting with the interface, I asked for it to generate some contours. We have a shapefile generated here that we saw visually. However, what we're going to do now is run that same process as a script. I'm going to remove this layer that I just created. I'm going to delete it. And we did that just for the purpose of generating our script. So I'm going to delete the files I just generated. That's fine. I'm going to drag this off screen again. And I'm going to take the various actions that I embarked on within the application, and from those create a script. So export my script is an option right here. Again, it's thankfully, remember my directory output here. I'm just going to write that script file into the same folder where I looked at before. It will be a GMS file. This is the only option. It was mentioned about Python. You can create and work with Python scripts within Global Mapper, but not using this recording tool. I think Jeff provided that answer as well. Oh, I didn't stop recording. Thank you for that notification as well. It will continue to record. I can get to that in just a second. Let's go ahead and just write our script out at this stage. Again, for want of a better word, we'll call it contours. Yeah, I appreciate those folks in attendance. You're keeping me straight on my workflow here as well. So we'll save that. That file is now output. Again, I can stop recording as noted here. Now, anything I do within the interface is not going to be retained. I'll close the script builder, and now I can introduce this script editor. It's not new for 24. This was introduced in version 23. Prior to that, if I wanted to show you the script I just built, I would open it in Notepad and show you how we can manipulate it within that application. We don't need to do that anymore. We can open it directly within the application itself using our script editor. So again, previously we looked at the script builder. Now we're going to look at the script editor. And again, it'll pop up a dialog box that allows me to create scripts dynamically. I can simply type in here if that's what I want to do. I can also open a script that already exists, and you'll see options to save and save as or save all as well. So we'll go ahead and open the file I just generated. And as remember, the last time I did some scripting work, let me go to my desktop here, with apologies for having to navigate through my folders. This is what I just generated. This is the script I just created. And if I click open, it will display the contents of that within the dialog box. Jeff, I know you've been working with this or you're kind of involved in this. Maybe you could describe a little bit about the colors we're seeing here to explain, some of the
that's probably one of the, I think, the best features of the script editor is the ability to have what we call syntax highlighting. So for those of you who are used to, working in any other script language or scripting environment, syntax highlighting lets us see our commands, our parameters, and the variables associated with those. So the very top of this script, the import directory tree is the command, the parameter is the directory, and then the variable is the file path in this case. So a really easy way to identify different portions of your script. One of the things I'll also say here is that, we used the script builder to build this script initially, but I think the fact that David's coming into the script editor here is a great example of how you would probably continue to use the script builder, right? You've already maybe made your contours here once for this file that David's working with, and now you're going to adjust this script or change it a little bit so that you can apply this workflow automated to a whole variety of data. So the script builder really gave us a great way to have a starting point to automate further workflows.
Yeah, and in fact, Jeff, I think we will be doing that in just a few minutes because I want to show you another streamlined way for generating scripts by capturing the contents of a dialog box. We'll go to phase 2 in just a second. But again, just by way of preview, the script, as you can see, has all of the necessary commands, parameters. If you're not familiar with these, by the way, don't worry. If you want some information on scripting, there's a very extensive user guide that's included in our help system that describes the supported commands, the corresponding parameters, et cetera, et cetera. So don't feel like you're kind of jumping into the deep end here. This is actually a very easy way for me to create a script without actually knowing or having to memorize this specific commands, parameters, et cetera. Okay, so I'm not going to make any edits at this stage. I'm going to close the script editor. And from off screen, I'm once again going to drag into view my Windows Explorer window because I want to go up a level and I'm going to change the file that's in the folder that I targeted. This is the terrain layer that Global Mapper has on screen, and Global Mapper targets in that script. And obviously for me to run the script again, it doesn't really make any sense because I've already generated the contours. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove this there and simply going to delete it at this stage. We'll remove it from that directory. Won't let me do it because it's already loaded in Global Mapper. Let me unload my data first. That's fine. I'm not going to save the workspace here. Once again, let me bring up Windows Explorer. It should let me do it this time. Right click will delete it once again. That data is gone. What I'm going to do now is replace it with another terrain layer. Now, this maybe is a good illustration of how this specific script could be useful, where I didn't target a specific layer, but rather the contents of a directory. I have a different elevation grid, this being for a little town right here along the coast of Maine. I'm going to run the script as an external process, and we should see a new set of contours. So with my fingers crossed, I'm going to go back into the output folder where I generated that script. I'm simply going to double click my script to run it externally. I'm confident that the script syntax is correct because obviously it's something was created dynamically within the application. I have double clicked, I'm waiting. Obviously it has to go through the process of generating my contours. Let me refresh my window here a couple of times. It should, the parameters should be the same. It should write the data into contours. I'm a little nervous here that it's not working, but let's go back out and go back in. I don't know why it's not working. It should, but if everything went according to what I hoped would happen, it should have written my new scripted contours into the same folder. I'm baffled as to why that is not working.
One good use case this highlights is that you can also run scripts directly within the application. And when you do that, if you have any typos in your scripts, you'll get an alert telling you where the script looks like it may have failed. So a really helpful use case if, right now maybe something's not running because we have a typo or a missed space or period or something like that. You don't get an alert when it runs in the background, but if you run it within Global Mapper, you'll be able to see what went wrong if we're getting an alert there.
Yeah, it looks like there's already the checkbox. Thank you again from one of our attendees for pointing out that the run script based on the context of the main map view. I'll load this script again internally. With apologies, it didn't work as an automated process, but I'll load this internally and we can run the script right here. We're going to see the results in real time on the screen, but we'll also, it looks like export vector did not work because again,
so the issue here is the elevation range at Castine is very different from Albuquerque, and so it couldn't generate contours there.
Absolutely. That is okay. So this example obviously would require some additional tweaking. With apologies, this was something we figured we'd do on the fly here. But this is a good illustration, again, in an imperfect world, how your script editor can point out any issues. That is the reason why it didn't generate contours. And that's, again, a good reason to use the embedded editor. But okay, takeaway here is the process of building that script initially has been streamlined simply by recording those actions within the application itself. So yeah, with apologies for this specific demonstration because I changed my data. Those hard-coded bounds, elevation bounds, were not applicable for this new data. One other thing I want to point out, and we are going to run out of time again because of the amount of content we need to cover. One other thing I want to point out in terms of scripting, I just want to show you this in passing, is the ability to capture manually the contents of a specific dialog box. Now, specifically some of the analysis dialog boxes. I'm going to bring up the option to create watershed. Maybe I want to generate a watershed analysis for this area. Again, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this component of Global Mapper as used within the interface, where we basically define the potential for the terrain to support water flow, groundwater, surface water. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but the important thing to note here is whatever I establish in terms of parameters is going to be something that I can copy and add to a script. So you'll see copy script is going to be available. You'll see this in many of the analysis dialog boxes in Global Mapper. Contour generation will be another one, a breakline delineation. All of those analysis tools now have the ability to copy, after you've established the parameters, copy that to your script. This, in a way, it's similar to what I showed before, except it's specific to one action. So I could then incorporate just this command into an existing script. And again, I'm going to bring up the script editor, and I can basically add that to my script. Once again, I'll open the script I had before, the uncooperative script, and I can simply add maybe a new command here. I'm just going to paste from my clipboard, and you can see generate watershed, et cetera, et cetera. All the parameters that I defined previously are now included in here. Again, syntax, color coding has been applied. It recognizes my commands, recognizes the parameters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to run this script. I'm a little afraid that it will not work because for same reason as last time, but this would now allow me to generate a watershed or incorporate that component into a script. Again, that ability to capture, in this case, a very specific component of a workflow, rather than having to manually key that in either in the script editor or, again, in an external file, if that's how you still build scripts, is a very useful tool. Any other questions, Jeff, that came in about this? I know you've been keeping an eye on those.
A couple specific questions I'll answer quietly here, David, but nothing else right now.
Okay, so there was a mention about word wrap. If within your script you include this backslash, it will actually wrap your text. That is an indication that it'll take a new line. It doesn't imply that it's a new command, but rather allows you to space your text. So I could go through this example and basically make it a little more easy to read within the script editor. So that, yeah, that is an option for making it a little bit more readable. Okay, let me close the script. I'm not going to save the changes I made here. Obviously, if I wanted to, I could export this as a new script. I'm not going to worry about that. We're going to shift our focus. I'm going to unload my data, and I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint because our next section, as I mentioned at the start, is arguably, the most powerful component that we've yet introduced in Global Mapper, and that's kriging. Jeff, I'm going to leave this to you maybe to explain by way of starting what a little bit about kriging is.
Sure.
Let me give you there we go.
Okay, so kriging is a very popular, geospatial analysis method used for interpolation. I'm sure many of you who are Global Mapper users or any other GIS users are familiar with, creating some type of terrain surface, DEM. Maybe you're specifically creating a DTM or a DSM from some type of point cloud. That in itself is inherently an interpolation method. Kriging can certainly be very technical and very geostatistics heavy. But from a general perspective, kriging's goal is really twofold. First, we're trying to implement a method that allows us to have an unbiased prediction and also helps us to limit what we call sampling bias and minimizing error. And so while that all sounds very heavy and advanced, I find it useful to think about how kriging is applied and how it's used. Maybe you work in the soil sciences or in geology, and you need to understand soil type from a subset of soil samples. Kriging actually developed originally for gold prospecting and estimating based on samples where miners might find more gold. But it has now been applied to a whole variety of industries. If we think about modern agriculture and we're trying to maybe monitor plant health or nutrient concentration in the soil, a farmer with thousands of acres isn't going to go out and measure, in 1 meter increments, but they can take a representative sampling of their field and then use kriging to understand what the nutrient values or whatever they're looking at may look like at areas they haven't visited. We see it used in things like hydrology and water analysis, maybe something as simple as, measuring water turbidity and understanding what the clarity of my water may look like across certain regions. So really it can be used a whole variety of ways, whether we're talking, rainfall, snowfall analysis. Anytime we're trying to understand or interpolate from a smaller set of samples to a more complete understanding of our data sets, kriging is a great way to go. Let's go ahead and move into Global Mapper, and I'll talk a little more as we look at the tool.
Yeah. While you're transitioning, sorry, I thought my mic was muted. While you're transitioning there, the question came in, and this is one that we've discussed internally as well. Can you use this with LiDAR? Jeff, maybe if you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, so good question. The answer to that is yes. And I think the more detailed response to that is there are times when kriging is and isn't appropriate. And sometimes with very dense data, it is not appropriate, but you certainly can use kriging on a point cloud. The data I just loaded here happens to be regular old vector points with depth associated with them. It's sounding values, but you could certainly use it in that way. Before we get into the tool, One thing I'll highlight is to, some of you might be saying, well, who cares? I can already make a tin, or I make my DSM or my DTM another way. And that's perfectly valid. Where kriging helps us is it takes into account more than just the distance between my points, right? So let's zoom in here for a second, and I might say, where my cursor is, I don't know what the value is, right? I don't have a point there, but I can estimate that based on these 2 points nearby it. That's pretty standard. Where kriging goes one step farther is that it also takes into account the relationship between all of these known points and how their values vary. So for instance, today, we are looking at depth and understanding how depth may vary between our sample points and the areas we haven't visited. So let's go ahead and take a look at the tool, and we'll talk pretty generically about what we're setting up and how we're doing it. So this tool has a lot in it, and we'll obviously only hit some of the highlights today. The most important thing that I want to understand is that once I've selected my source layer, I get a chart or a graph derived from the point data. What we can think of this as telling us, and I zoomed in here a little bit so we can see our error bars, is that how my points vary over distance. So the farther I get away, my x-axis is distance, the farther I get away, the more variance I have in my data. So this tells us what our source data looks like. And we have a variety of parameters and details here that are both calculated from the data and can be edited. So certainly something, if you're interested in kriging in detail, to take a look into. I'm going to collapse some of these for a second, and we're going to take a look at what would, generally speaking, be our next step. So I have what's called my empirical model. It tells me what my data looks like. Then kriging allows me to pick a theoretical model to fit my data. And there are a whole bunch of standard models available. You can drill into each one and see a variety of information about it. The general level, we care about that model's shape, so how the model matches my data, and its chi-square value. For those of you who want to know more details about that, go ahead and take a look into our knowledge base. It'll expand on how all of those variables are used. So you can go through and compare. In this case, we're just going to stick with the Gaussian model here. And then I'm going to take a look at my actual kriging. So I had mentioned earlier, this is a two-step process. First, we choose our model, and then we use that model to create our interpolation. And what that model allows us to do is give weights to all of my sample points, so I am, as best as possible, predicting values for regions that we haven't visited. A variety of output options. Most common is to make what we call in Global Mapper an elevation grid, but think of it as a raster surface, a continuous surface. And I'm going to go ahead and run that here, and we'll look at all of our outputs. So this is my source layer. I'm going to shut that off for a second, and I've created 3 output layers. So you always get estimated points as your output, although probably not what we're most concerned with. What we are probably most concerned with is our estimated output grid. And I'm going to load this in relation to my points. So I can see now, based on my sample points, what I expect values to be at all regions now as part of my continuous surface. One of the benefits of kriging is that it also inherently calculates uncertainty. So in relation to getting an output surface estimated, I also get estimated uncertainty. So this tells me, and again, this is the generic Atlas shader and Global Mapper coloring my data. So green is low values, red is high values. What I see is that my uncertainty gets higher where I have fewer sample points, which stands to logical reason. This is important because this is a very clean sample, but if maybe you had a spotty sample and you knew that in this area, I actually need to know what's here because this is an important part of my property or my study area. Seeing this uncertainty allows us to go in and decide maybe whether or not, as the user, I need to resample, in this area. All of these features are now able to be exported out of Global Mapper, however you need to handle them for your further workflows. I will say, for those of you who have even more of an interest in kriging, we have a great Ask the Experts video coming out, and we'll have some more functionality coming to the kriging tool in the future. So if this is something you're interested in, as always, feel free to contact us and ask more.
Okay, we just had a few comments come in there, Jeff. Specifically about LiDAR, the follow-up to LiDAR, we had a couple of people mention they have used this method with LiDAR and it gives better interpolation. So there has been discussion internally as to the merits of this for LiDAR, given that LiDAR tends to be fairly dense and closely spaced. But obviously,
yeah,
there's
and I
folks
don't
out
think
there.
we should ever take that as a blanket statement, right? When we get into the statistics of this nature, there's always so much, domain and specific field knowledge that is going to impact how, a certain method is useful.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, as noted, this is obviously a very brief introduction. This is, as I said at the start, a fairly complex procedure. I know many of you are familiar with this. Some of you are probably not. We don't expect you, obviously, to pick up everything in this brief session. If you are interested in seeing this, if you think that this kind of predictive modeling process would be useful for the type of work you do, we will be incorporating this into our training. We're working on that right now, actually. So our next training class coming up in November, we'll have some examples of this, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions more directly, maybe as they relate to your workflow. Okay, let's get back to our list here. Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to grab the screen back again if my mouse cooperates. And I'm going to remove this. Obviously, this is also something that can be saved. The work you do here, the parameters you apply, settings you apply, and the output would be something you would save in the workspace. And just for the sake of what we're doing today, I'm going to unload the data. I'm not going to save this. Back to our checklist. The next few are fairly straightforward here in terms of these procedures. It looks like my PowerPoint is gone. I'm not sure why. Give me 1 second so I can bring it back. Too many buttons here, too many windows open. There we go. That's where we left off. We were talking about kriging. Back to my checklist here. Quick look at LiDAR swath separation. I did introduce this right at the start. As you can see, we have a visualization here of overlap. We're actually going to use exactly the same data that's noted here in the screenshot. A little lazy in terms of preparing my screenshots today. So I'm going to be bringing that data in its original form. It's a point cloud, it's a LiDAR file. This tool specifically addressed a specific need for one of our customers, that being the USGS. They asked for this tool specifically to visualize these LiDAR overlap areas, or the swath, determine swath separation. So in doing this and implementing this, you'll see it's a very specific procedure that we follow. Now the workspace, hopefully it's in my recent files list. If not, I may have to go browse for it. Oh, it's right here. Is a point cloud. The point cloud that I'm working with here, LiDAR data, is pre-colored based on the point source ID. You'll notice that in the dropdown here. This, for those of you not familiar with Global Mapper Pro, we have numerous ways of visualizing a point cloud or LiDAR data. You'll see the various options we have here. The one that I've chosen here for this workspace is point source ID, which is basically flight lines. And you can see quite clearly here, we do have quite a significant overlap. That's what we're going to map. That's what we're going to try to visualize here. And the way the process works is we go to a brand new button here in the LiDAR toolbar, create Swath Separation Images, as you'll see here. Let's just go ahead and load the button. Fairly simple interface here. We define our resolution at which this is going to be analyzed. We define our grid method. Those of you familiar with the gridding processes within Global Mapper, this mirrors those. Triangulation, I think Jeff mentioned this in the context of kriging as well. Binning is what we're going to use in this case. Binning, determining your average within an area. And then we'll use all returns. We're not going to do any filtering here. We'll just define this with, use this based on the entire extent. We can then determine how this is going to look in terms of output, and you can create your own custom shader here. I have one that I created for a different situation, my Earth shader. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use one of the ones that was predetermined for this application using the colors you see here. When we initiate this is a fairly unique procedure as far as Global Mapper is concerned, because typically when we run analysis dialog box like this, we immediately see the results on the screen. In this case, the requirement was to actually generate the output file. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm being prompted to name the file. It is a GeoTIFF. As you'll see, I'm trying to type and talk at the same time and failing in both scores. You'll see that I've named the file overlap, and we'll click save. It will immediately load that into the application itself. But that external file has been created. I'll turn off the point cloud, and again, we can see the results. Those points that are outside the extent of this swath, that overlap area, have been rendered based on intensity. So you're actually seeing a raster version. This is a GeoTIFF. You're seeing a rasterized version of the point cloud. Those points that are in the overlap area, again, defined by the shader that I had applied, you can see quite clearly represented. The non-overlap points are rendered just based on intensity, as I said. So interesting little tool for doing that overlap. Again, new button you may have noticed in the LiDAR toolbar, create swath separation images. I take the easy ones, Jeff. You get the hard ones and I get the easy ones. Okay. The next bullet, as I said at the introduction, is a component of kind of the interaction between Global Mapper Desktop and Global Mapper Mobile. Those of you not familiar with it, it is a application that we developed several years ago that can be used on your iOS or your Android devices, and it works in conjunction with a desktop application. Data goes back and forth, and I think what Jeff is going to show us now is a little bit of an improvement in that data flow. So Jeff, I'm going to again go back to where I was previously. Once again, It's going to prompt me here to save my workspace. I'm not going to do that in this case. And let me give you control once again.
Great. Okay. So what we're going to talk about now is the idea that perhaps me as maybe I'm the data manager, the desktop GIS guy, and I have sent field users out into the field with some data that I need them to record and then send back to me. And what I want to do is have the ability to quickly review, approve, reject any changes which they have made in the field. And so what we've done, the mobile data management tool has been around for a version or two of Global Mapper now. And what we've done is added ability to that to import files and review them. So, initially you're able to wirelessly connect to your device to send data back to Global Mapper Desktop, or do all your exporting right out of this tool as well. Now what we're going to look at is reviewing changes from field data. So I'm going to load some data here, and we're using the terminology, the from file. So this is our file that was changed in the field. So I'm taking the edits from that file and saving them to my source file. Let me make sure here, David and I looked at this earlier. I just want to make sure I've got the right data selected, but you can always browse to your file path. It's just remembering where I was before. And now this is a little bit of a extreme example in that I made a lot of changes to this. I actually intentionally had this error pop for us. All this is telling us is that my field user may have been working in an older version of Global Mapper, right? It's not always likely that everybody in your office is going to update all at once. And so we have some things in the new version that may not have been present in the older version of the app. You'll just get that little alert to let you know that. So when the files load, I can see information on my source file, information on the file that I'm taking in from the field, and then a list of all the layers of data that this contains. Now, I have the ability to choose to only show my differences, but in this case, I made a change in every layer just so we have, a large amount of them to take a look at. So showing only my differences would still show the same amount of data here. Now, for each layer, we see high level, the name of it and whether or not it exists in the other file. So there's some data originally that is not in source file, and conversely, some data that I gathered in the field. So really, I made probably more changes here than you would see in a normal workflow, but it lets us see how everything is structured. Now, as the person reviewing the data, I have the ability to really drill down to details as much as I need to. So we can get down to the vertex level of a feature individual attributes, et cetera, depending on the detail you need to have as you're reviewing the data. And you can do that for anywhere that we have a change in our data set. Really get in there and see, okay, are these attributes in fact recorded properly and things of that nature. So we give the user a lot of control dependent on the workflow that they need to handle. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to keep all. And when I do that, we're going to get a little indication here. So rather than having a question mark of what to do, I'm going to have a little arrow indicating which is being kept. And so I'm keeping all of my changes, and the arrow just points to one of those columns. After that, so I always like to have the always load after merge. So I'm going to merge this data and then automatically load it into Global Mapper to take a look at it. When I merge it, I just have to give it a new name unless I want to overwrite my original file. In this case, I don't. So I'm just going to call it merged and save it out. My generic mobile package creation options, just leave those as default for right now. And then once that gets written, I'll be prompted to decide which data I want to load into the application. So in this case, maybe I'll load everything. And now I can see all of that data here. In this case, the two features that changed out in the field, let me close this window, are the point and the line that I recorded when out in the field. We can see that with all of our original data now. So again, a really easy way to review and see what changes have been created in the field. And you know, if you're someone who uses this type of workflow, keep an eye out for even more improvements coming to this tool down the road.
Yeah, we had a question come in. Somebody put a comment in. They're not overly familiar with this platform with Global Mapper Mobile. Obviously not something we're talking about in any great depth today. We haven't even looked at the application itself. Someone said, can this workflow be introduced in more detail? I'm going to suggest that you look through previous GeoTalks Express presentations. Jeff, I know you were involved in recording one where we went through in more detail. Do you remember when that was? Off the top of my head, I cannot. Several months ago.
It would have been since release in July. It may have been in August. What I can do is, while we're talking here, I'll take a look and I'll post the link for you.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, obviously a lot of these tools, they're relevant to additional functions, but obviously we don't have a great deal of time here to cover them in detail. So I know we're whetting your appetite a little bit on some of these other tools, but yeah, Jeff is going to go off and do some research, and we'll post that link in there. Those of you not familiar with Global Mapper Mobile, maybe that's something you want to take a look at as well. Yeah. This component obviously very specifically for managing the data that has returned. Okay, how are we for time? We're almost out of time. I have one more thing I want to show you here, and this is actually a workflow we squeezed in at the last minute. I think this is an important one. And it also allows us to introduce to kind of our audience at large a tool that is a very important part of Global Mapper Pro, and that's Pixels to Points. Pixels to Points is a tool that allows you to take overlapping images and ultimately through a procedure called structure from motion, convert those into 3D data, a point cloud, a mesh, and there's other outputs as well. And we're not going to go into the details again on that. We have presentations that cover that in more detail, but today I want to show you very specifically an important requirement for the procedure to work correctly, and that is ensuring sufficient overlap between images. Up until this point, it's been a fairly arbitrary process to determine, do I have enough overlap? I can see where my images are, I can see where they were captured, but for the procedure to work, you need to have a significant amount of overlap, basically looking at every identifiable feature from multiple perspectives. That's the underlying process, how this works. We've introduced a new tool that actually generates a report for that. I'm going to take a look at that one. This data will likely be familiar to many of you. If you were here on Tuesday, you saw this data. We're using the same files. This is a file we use quite a lot, or some data. Just to get perspective here, those of you who are not familiar with this, I've loaded some point features on my map. Those point features represent camera locations. They each contain a link to an image, that image being an image that was collected by a drone. You can quite clearly see the flight lines here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not going to go through the procedure as noted, but I will show you the output that we get from this process. Let me temporarily turn the images off. I'll turn this other off as well and show you the output of that process. It is really cool point cloud 3D data. mesh data as well, ortho images included in here. So if you're not familiar with this, this is as far as I'm going to go with the actual procedure. I'll pop a 3D viewer up and you'll see this a little more clearly. There's my 3D point cloud. If you want to know how I got this from simple images, again, you're going to have to visit one of our other presentations. What I want to do today very specifically is address the idea of image overlap. In order for us to recreate that three-dimensional environment, we need to ensure that there is sufficient overlap between the various frames that I've taken here. I'm going to go through the motions of the pixels to points tool simply to show you this new functionality. Button right here in the LiDAR toolbar, final button in the list here. And again, we could argue that this is actually the most powerful part of our LiDAR toolkit, this pixels to points tool. And again, I'm just simply going to load the images that I have on my screen. They'll be displayed here in a tabular view. I can select one. It will hopefully be displayed over here in just a second. It'll take a little bit of time to refresh. Let me bring that up again. There we go. I think I have my mesh on. Let me turn that off. And you can see, again, the images themselves. Now, we're not going to go through the workflow, but if we did, we would generate the output I previewed a second ago. What I'm going to do specifically is go to the map menu and load ground coverage polygons. This in and of itself is not new, but I will show you how you can use this in a very creative way in just a second. But what this does when you initiate it is it will create a file, an HTML file that will give you a report of the amount of overlap between these images that we're seeing in the background here. How much overlap are we going to have? Do we have sufficient overlap to create a good quality output? Asking me if I want just all selected or all. I could choose the yes button to process all. It will then allow me to define this style. Now, let me tell you right now, if you go through this yourself, you will have a different default style. I went through this earlier and actually changed some of the style characteristics for reasons that hopefully will become clear in just a second. The default style is to create outlines or polygons that are quite boldly represented. And when you have multiple overlapping polygons, it's a little bit difficult to see what's going on. So I've changed the visualization of these and I just remembered that in my setup. Virtually transparent, not quite transparent. I've got, what, a 3.1% transparency. No outline, solid fill, and it's a red color. You can't see it here, but it's a red color. So again, you're going to see something different if you do this yourself. We'll click OK. And immediately in the background, you'll see the result of that visually. But most importantly, for what we've introduced with 24 from off screen, I'm going to drag in a browser window here, and you can see we've now generated automatically a report that shows me the degree of coverage in my image points. You'll see coverage ratio, overlap ratio, and then specifically for forward overlap and for side overlap. And it looks like, the degree of overlap is about average of what, almost 80% overlap. That is definitely going to be sufficient to give us a good quality output here. Side overlap the same. We then get into more detail, and within each image, we show the approximate area. Jeff, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of these additional options that are displayed here.
Sure. So the first option we're seeing here is essentially the relative size of each image compared to the average, right? So all of our images represent some portion of the ground. This gives us a relative value of which of those show more or less than average. And usually you would expect values right around 1, depending on the quality of your flight.
Yeah, that's represented as a histogram as well. You can see that graphically displayed.
If you had any major outliers here, maybe you had an image you want to ignore for further processing or something like that. So this helps kind of refine that a little bit. And then here is just where we see how much, what percentage of our full area has how much coverage, right? So in this case, a hit is a picture, and since our flight wasn't perfectly square in this scenario, right, this just looks at the overall bounding box. So there's a high amount of our area that doesn't have coverage, but simply because it wasn't intended to be covered by the flight. But another useful statistic there to see how your coverage works out. And then again, just a visual image names of what images overlap with which.
Yeah, so, and then that's HTML. It'll open in your browser. Now, before you initiate the process, you have enough confidence or sufficient confidence to proceed. There's no point going through the procedure and then realizing after you've waited for that to happen to realize your overlap was not sufficient. So that initial report is a useful, almost pre-workflow QA process for your images. And I'm going to close the dialog box because I'm not going to go through the process itself, just to kind of wrap this up by showing why I chose the colors that I did. And you can see here, and this is just, it's not a function of pixels to points, but merely a function of how our digitizer works. We can see overlapping polygons, of which there are about 147, I believe. That's the number of images that are in this set. Each of those, because they overlap, influence the degree of intensity of the color, because they're almost transparent, but not quite. So I can see very clearly visually where the maximum amount of overlap is in this area. Now, these are polygons. It's hard to visualize these because I've dropped the borders out. One thing I want to show you here as well is for any given point, let me turn on some imagery here so we get a little bit of a geographic perspective. If I'm interested in making sure, for instance, this building has sufficient coverage, I want to know, maybe it's on the periphery of my flight line, I want to make sure that I've got sufficient here. We can use the info tool now that we have vector polygons on our screen and simply select, and I'll make sure that I do not want to load the corresponding data. It is creating a link from one of the attribute fields. I'll bypass that and I'll simply show the information. And for that one image, I can see a summary of the information that was in that image. That's basically the footprint of the image and the metadata for that image. But more importantly, if I right click at that point, you can't see what I'm doing on my screen, but I'm right clicking with my mouse, it will cycle through all of the relevant images, giving me a quick report as to what's going to be covering that area, what images are there. So a visual representation. This is not new, I should stress. This is just, while we're talking overlap, this is something you can do with this tool. Again, right-clicking with my mouse, cycling through each of these individual polygons, as you can see. Now, I think we're almost out of time, but there's one more thing I want to show you, which we're trying to figure out a way to make this as relevant as possible. I want to turn on a new layer here. This layer has a single little point. I'm going to grab my digitizer. That point really doesn't have any value. All I'm going to do with that point is drag it to a location. Again, maybe a feature on the ground that I want to make sure that we have sufficient coverage. So I'm just dragging it manually. I'm going to drop it right here. And I'm going to initiate a process. I can get this a couple of ways. I'm going to use my digitizer. I'm going to right click and go to advanced selection options. And I want to select all the areas containing that point. Now, this is, again, going to give me a visual representation of how many images are in that area. Bottom left corner of my screen, if you take a note where my cursor is located, we can see that number displayed here, 23 for that location. Now, because this is simply a vector point, I can simply pick it up and drag it to a new location. I'll initiate move here. I'll move it maybe to another building here. Again, we're going to target this building. How many images do we have? I can repeat that process by choosing the tool. It's not in my recent files. I thought it was my recent tools. I have to go to the right click again. Again, we'll go where we were before, analysis measure, or advanced selection options, and select area features. And again, we get a report. So that can be done dynamically. There was some discussion this could be also done using our vector tools, some of the new vector tools we have for spatial operations. You could initiate the same process. So just a kind of, when we're talking overlap, just a little bit of a shoehorn here of another workflow that may be relevant when talking overlap for visualization. Jeff, you've been answering some questions here. Any that we need to share before we wrap up our session?
A couple generic ones on the larger pixels to points process, and I will say, generally speaking, once you run pixels to points and you create your output point cloud, you can then work through all the traditional Lidar, processing and analysis, whether that's classification, filtering, feature extraction, terrain creation. All of that is available to you once you run pixels to points. We will throw up I have sent to a lot of you, contact our support team. That's sincere. They're great. We'll post their email and they'll be able to get you details and answers as we wrap up here.
Yeah, perfect segue. So we are out of time. Just to overshot the top of the hour by just a little bit. We almost made it this time, Jeff. But yeah, we threw a lot at you. Obviously, a lot of new functionality in Global Mapper Pro, and combining that with what was introduced in the standard version, upgrading to version 24 of Pro, you're going to get a lot of new tools. If you have additional questions, Jeff noted the email. I think he posted it in the answer to some of the questions, but it's noted on here as well. geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com if you have questions about Pro or indeed about the standard edition. If you're interested in licensing questions, if you're considering using Global Mapper, maybe you're not yet using it, the folks in our sales team, orders@bluemarblegeo.com, would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have, set you up with a trial, set you up with a demo as well, that we can maybe set up a meeting to go through some of these tools more specifically. And if you're not using Global Mapper Pro, link at the bottom here, globalmappergeo.com. You'll see the menus at the top of the screen, but you can go right to Global Mapper Pro and again, download a copy and set it through its paces. Jeff, thank you very much for sharing your expertise, especially with kriging. That's a difficult one sometimes to get your head around, and you know, we saw the questions come in, so obviously the folks out there are interested in this tool.
Yeah,
It is going to be
you're
continuing
welcome.
to.
Thanks for having me back again. I hope we got everybody excited to take a look at what's new in 24 Pro themselves.
Exactly, and if your question was not answered, we got a lot today. If your question was not answered, we promise we will follow up with you directly, so take a look in your inbox. Final thing, recordings, as we mentioned, have been created here. We are making our recording. That will be posted soon. You'll get an announcement of its availability. Thank you, folks, for joining us today and indeed on Tuesday. We will see you again next month.